The soft melody of a grand piano filled the dimly lit luxury lounge. The kind of place where fortunes were made, secrets exchanged, and lives changed in an instant. At the center of it all, a young waitress, Danielle, stood frozen near the polished bar. Her hands trembled as she clutched her serving tray, her wide brown eyes locked on a sharply dressed man, a billionaire philanthropist who had just risen from his table and approached the gleaming piano in the corner. "Don't," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but laced with urgency. The man turned to her, confused, his hand hovering over the keys. "It's dangerous," she continued, stepping forward, her voice shaking but determined. "You can't play that piano." The room fell silent. Eyes darted between Danielle and the man, the air thick with anticipation. "Dangerous?" he scoffed. "What could possibly happen from playing a piano?" Danielle hesitated, her lips trembling, before she finally whispered, "You don't know what's been hidden inside." In that moment, a chilling noise echoed from the piano, a low, haunting creak that seemed to make the room itself shudder. The man's confident smirk faltered, and Danielle's plea turned into a desperate warning. "Step away," she said, her voice firm now, "or we'll all regret it." The man's hand wavered, but the temptation of the keys was too strong. He pressed one note, and then the world changed. The lounge exuded an air of understated opulence. Warm amber lighting bathed the room, casting long shadows across the mahogany walls adorned with portraits of composers and virtuosos. The grand piano stood at the center of it all, its black lacquered finish gleaming like liquid night under the soft spotlight. The soft murmur of conversations mingled with the clink of crystal glasses, and the gentle hum of classical music played by a hidden speaker system. It was a place where the elite came to unwind, where every detail whispered exclusivity and power. Among them stood Charles Wentworth, a man who seemed to embody the very essence of success. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit that accentuated his athletic frame, his silver cufflinks catching the light with every casual gesture. Charles wasn't just wealthy, he was influential. His name graced the covers of magazines, his philanthropy lauded at charity galas. To the world, he was a symbol of achievement, a man who had everything. But as he sipped his whiskey, his gaze fell on the piano, and something in his demeanor shifted. His smile, the one he wore like armor in public, faltered for the briefest moment. The faint lines around his eyes deepened, betraying a flicker of unease. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a crack in the polished veneer. "Sir?" A waitress's voice broke through his thoughts. He turned to see her, Danielle, a young woman with kind but cautious eyes. She looked out of place in the grandeur, her simple uniform contrasting sharply with the luxury around her. But her presence felt oddly grounding, a small reminder of something real in a world built on facades. Danielle hesitated, her tray clutched tightly in her hands. She wasn't used to addressing men like Charles Wentworth. His presence was magnetic, almost intimidating, but there was something in his eyes that unsettled her, a shadow that didn't belong to a man of his stature. "Is everything all right?" she asked cautiously, her voice soft but steady. Charles blinked as if startled by the question. He straightened, his charming smile snapping back into place like a mask. "Of course. Why wouldn't it be?" Danielle nodded, but her instinct told her otherwise. She'd worked here long enough to recognize when someone was hiding something. Charles wasn't the first wealthy patron to carry a burden that money couldn't erase. As she turned to leave, her eyes caught the piano again. A strange sensation crept over her, like a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. She shook it off, convincing herself it was just her imagination. Unbeknownst to her, Charles's gaze lingered on the piano too, his fingers twitching slightly at his side. A distant memory seemed to play behind his eyes. Something haunting, something unresolved. "Beautiful instrument, isn't it?" said a deep voice beside him. It was Gerald, an old friend and business partner, his tone jovial but his eyes sharp. "Indeed," Charles replied, forcing a lightness into his voice. Gerald's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "You've been staring at it all night, planning to play a tune." Charles chuckled, but it was hollow. "Maybe. It's been a while." Gerald raised an eyebrow, sensing the tension beneath the surface but choosing not to press further. Instead, he clapped Charles on the shoulder and changed the subject, his laughter filling the room. Yet, as the evening wore on, the piano remained a silent presence between them, a reminder of something unspoken, something waiting. In a private room tucked away from the main lounge, 3 men huddled around a table under dim, flickering light. The leader among them, Victor Hargrove, was a man who thrived in shadows. His chiseled features were hardened by years of ruthless ambition, his ice-blue eyes gleaming with a predatory sharpness. A self-made millionaire turned kingpin of the underworld, Victor had mastered the art of exploiting vulnerabilities, his charm as deadly as his schemes. "This has to go perfectly," Victor said, his voice low but commanding, slicing through the thick haze of cigar smoke. He tapped his finger on a blueprint of the lounge, the grand piano marked with an ominous red circle. "To think Charles Wentworth, the golden boy of high society, would unknowingly hand us the key to his empire," quipped Damien, Victor's right-hand man. His smirk was as slimy as his reputation. A man who thrived on deceit and danger. "The device is already inside," Victor continued, ignoring Damien's sarcasm. "All we need is for him to play. Just one note, and—" He snapped his fingers, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the confined room. The third man, Elias, an engineer with a nervous disposition, fidgeted in his chair. "You're sure it'll work? No glitches? If it doesn't go as planned—" "It will work," Victor interrupted coldly, leaning forward until his face was inches from Elias. "And if it doesn't, you'll be the one explaining why to me." Elias swallowed hard and nodded, his eyes darting nervously to the blueprints. The plan was simple but devastating. The piano had been rigged with an explosive device, one that would trigger the moment a key was pressed. The blast wouldn't just eliminate Charles, it would serve as a message to anyone who dared oppose Victor's growing empire. "Timing is everything," Victor concluded, his voice steady and menacing. "When Charles starts to play, we'll already be out of here. No witnesses, no mistakes." But what they didn't know was that someone had overheard every word. Danielle had been on her way to the kitchen when the muffled voices caught her attention. She wasn't one to eavesdrop, but something in the tone, a sharp, threatening edge, made her pause. Staying out of sight, she crouched by the door, her heart pounding as she strained to hear. At first, their words made no sense. Piano? Device? Explosion? But as the pieces began to fall into place, a cold wave of dread washed over her. They were planning something horrible, and Charles was the target. Her breath hitched, and she instinctively pressed a hand to her chest, trying to calm her racing heart. But the fear was quickly replaced by determination. She couldn't just stand by and let this happen. Danielle's mind raced. She didn't know Charles personally, but she knew enough to understand that he didn't deserve to be part of whatever twisted game these men were playing. Quietly, she slipped away from the door and hurried back into the lounge. The sight of Charles, still seated near the piano, sent a jolt of urgency through her. The conspirators would make their move soon. She had to warn him. But how? What if they saw her talking to him? What if they were watching her right now? Her hands trembled as she set her tray down, glancing nervously around the room. She needed a plan, but all she had was the mounting fear that time was running out. Danielle approached Charles cautiously, her steps faltering as doubt gnawed at her resolve. How could she explain what she'd overheard without sounding crazy? And even if she managed to convince him, would he believe her, a simple waitress over his powerful peers? "Excuse me, Mr. Wentworth," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. Charles looked up, his expression polite but distracted. "Yes." Danielle opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. The room seemed to close in around her, the conspirators' cold voices replaying in her mind. She glanced at the piano, its polished surface now a symbol of impending doom. I just wanted to thank you for your generosity," she said instead, her voice trembling. Charles nodded, offering a faint smile before turning his attention back to his drink. Danielle cursed herself under her breath. She had failed. The stakes were too high for hesitation, yet fear had paralyzed her. As she stepped away, she noticed Victor and Damien watching her from across the room. Their expressions were unreadable, but their presence was a chilling reminder of the danger she was in. She needed to act and fast. But how could she stop a plan so meticulously crafted? How could one ordinary woman outwit men who lived and thrived in the shadows? Her mind raced as she retreated to the back of the lounge, her hands shaking and her pulse pounding in her ears. One thing was certain. If she didn't find the courage to intervene, it wouldn't just be Charles's life at stake. The lounge had grown quieter as the evening wore on, the soft hum of conversation fading into the background. Charles rose from his seat, drawn once more to the grand piano. He could feel the weight of everyone's gaze as he crossed the room. For a moment, he hesitated, his fingers brushing over the sleek black surface. Danielle's heart thundered in her chest. She had tried to warn him indirectly, dropping hints, even accidentally spilling a drink to delay him, but nothing had worked. Now, as he reached for the piano bench, she knew there was no time left. "Mr. Wentworth," she called out, her voice sharp and desperate. Charles froze, turning to look at her with a mixture of curiosity and annoyance. The room fell silent, all eyes now on the young waitress. "You can't play," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "It's dangerous." Charles frowned, confusion etched across his face. "Dangerous? What are you talking about?" Victor and Damien exchanged glances from their shadowed corner of the room, their calm facades cracking. Danielle had become a problem, a loose end that needed cutting. "It's just a piano," Charles said, his tone placating but dismissive. "I appreciate your concern, but it's been tampered with," Danielle blurted out. Her voice broke, and her fear spilled into every word. "Someone rigged it. If you play, something terrible will happen." A ripple of shock and murmurs spread through the room. Charles stared at her, his brow furrowed, while Victor stepped forward, his expression cold and calculating. "This is absurd," Victor said, his voice smooth but edged with menace. "The poor girl must be mistaken or overwhelmed. Let's not ruin the evening with baseless accusations." Danielle shook her head vehemently. "I heard you. You and your men. You're planning to kill him." The crowd gasped. Charles's eyes widened, and Victor's mask of calm shattered for a fraction of a second, replaced by a flash of fury. Charles turned to Victor, his voice sharp. "What is she talking about?" Victor opened his mouth, ready to spin a lie, but Danielle wasn't done. "They planted a device inside the piano," she said, her words rushing out like a dam breaking. "It'll explode the moment you play." Charles's gaze snapped back to the piano, realization dawning on his face. He took a step back, his mind racing. "Is this true?" Victor smirked, the pretense of civility slipping away. "You've always been too trusting, Charles. That's your greatest flaw." The room erupted into chaos as Victor signaled to Damien, who reached inside his jacket for a concealed weapon. But Danielle wasn't about to let them win. Danielle moved faster than she thought possible, grabbing the closest object, a heavy serving tray, and hurling it at Damien's arm. The weapon clattered to the floor as a panicked shout echoed through the room. "Get everyone out!" Charles yelled, his authoritative voice cutting through the chaos. Guests scrambled for the exits as Victor lunged toward the piano, intent on triggering the device manually. Danielle wasn't about to let him. She dove forward, grabbing his arm with every ounce of strength she had. Victor growled, shoving her aside, but the commotion had bought Charles enough time to intervene. With surprising agility, Charles tackled Victor, pinning him against the wall. "What have you done?" he demanded, his voice shaking with rage. Victor sneered. "What I had to. You're in the way, Charles. Always have been." Meanwhile, Danielle scrambled to the piano. She didn't know much about explosives, but she knew enough to recognize the faint hum and blinking red light beneath the lid. Her hands trembled as she searched for a way to disable it. "Don't touch it!" Elias's voice rang out from across the room. The nervous engineer stood frozen in the doorway, his face pale as a sheet. Danielle turned to him, desperation in her eyes. "Then help me, please." Elias hesitated, torn between fear and a sliver of conscience. Finally, he stepped forward, his hands shaking as he knelt beside Danielle. It's wired to the key mechanism," he stammered. "If it's already armed, one wrong move could." "We don't have time for could," Danielle snapped, her voice fierce despite her fear. "Just tell me what to do." Elias swallowed hard and pointed to a small panel near the base of the piano. "The control unit. If we disconnect it from the battery, carefully it'll deactivate." Danielle nodded, her hands moving with a steadiness she didn't know she possessed. With Elias guiding her, she located the wires and, after a tense moment of deliberation, severed the connection. The blinking light went dark. A wave of relief swept over her, but it was short-lived. Victor, seeing his plan unravel, broke free from Charles's grip and lunged for Elias. Charles intercepted him, throwing a punch that sent Victor sprawling. Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder by the second. Victor's men, realizing the operation was lost, fled through a side door. Victor himself struggled to his feet, but Charles stood in his way, his eyes blazing with anger. "You'll pay for this," Charles said, his voice low and steady. Victor smirked, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. "We'll see about that." Moments later, the police burst into the room, weapons drawn. Victor and Elias were apprehended, while Danielle sank to the floor, her adrenaline finally giving way to exhaustion. Charles approached her, his expression softening. "You saved my life," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. Danielle managed a weak smile. "I couldn't just stand by." As the chaos subsided, One thing became clear. Courage doesn't always come from strength. Sometimes it comes from the quiet determination to do what's right no matter the cost. The lounge, once filled with warmth and music, now felt eerily quiet. The remnants of chaos, the shattered glasses, overturned chairs and lingering tension, painted a stark picture of the night's events. The grand piano stood untouched, its dark sheen now a chilling reminder of how close tragedy had come. Charles sat at a corner table, his head in his hands. His usual composed demeanor was gone, replaced by a raw vulnerability that he hadn't shown in years. The betrayal cut deep, not just because of the plan to take his life, but because it had come from someone he once trusted. Victor had been more than a business associate. He'd been a friend, a confidant. They had built ventures together, shared victories and setbacks. To discover that greed and ambition had turned Victor against him was a blow Charles wasn't sure he could recover from. Danielle approached cautiously, her footsteps soft against the polished floor. She had been watching from afar, unsure if she should intervene. But the sight of Charles, so lost and broken, compelled her forward. "Mr. Wentworth?" she said gently. He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed but sharp. For a moment he seemed surprised to see her. Then his expression softened. "You don't have to call me that," he said, his voice hoarse. "After tonight, I think Charles is fine." Danielle smiled faintly and sat across from him. "Are you okay?" Charles let out a bitter laugh. "I'm alive. That's more than I can say for my trust in people." He shook his head, his gaze distant. "I should have seen it. The signs were there, but I ignored them. I let ambition blind me to the people around me." Danielle hesitated before speaking. "Sometimes, it's hard to see what's right in front of us, especially when we trust someone." He studied her for a moment, her words sinking in. "And you," he said, his tone shifting. "Why did you do it? Why risk everything to stop them?" Danielle looked down, her hands clasped tightly together. "Because I've seen what happens when people stay silent. My father, he worked for people like Victor. He always turned a blind eye, thinking it wasn't his place to interfere. It cost him his life." Her voice cracked, and she quickly wiped a tear away. "I couldn't let that happen again. Not if I could stop it." Charles nodded, a new respect growing in his eyes. "You're braver than most people I know, Danielle." The next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows of Charles's study, casting a warm glow over the room. Danielle sat nervously on a plush chair, her hands folded in her lap. She had been summoned by Charles, though she wasn't sure why. He entered moments later, a calm yet determined expression on his face. In his hands, he held an envelope and a small black box. "I've been thinking about what happened," he began, taking a seat across from her. "And about you." Danielle tilted her head, confused. "You didn't just save my life," he continued. "You reminded me of something I'd lost a long time ago. Faith in people. Trust in the goodness of someone willing to stand up for what's right." He slid the envelope across the table. "This is for you." Danielle hesitated before picking it up. Inside was a check with a number so large it made her gasp. I can't accept this," she stammered, her hands trembling. "Yes, you can," Charles said firmly. "You deserve it. Call it a gesture of gratitude, or an investment in someone I believe in. Use it for whatever you want. A fresh start, a dream, anything." Danielle blinked back tears, overwhelmed by the gesture. "Thank you," she whispered. "There's one more thing," Charles said, opening the black box to reveal a delicate golden bracelet. "This belonged to my mother. She gave it to me when I started my first business, told me it was a symbol of strength and perseverance. I think she'd want you to have it now." Danielle's hand covered her mouth, her emotions threatening to spill over. "I don't know what to say." Charles smiled warmly. "Just promise me one thing. Don't let anyone tell you that you're just anything. You proved last night that you're more than capable of changing the course of someone's life." She nodded, her heart full. "I promise." As Danielle left the estate, the golden bracelet glinting on her wrist, she felt something she hadn't in a long time, hope. And as Charles watched her go, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The world hadn't entirely lost its good people. Courage isn't reserved for heroes in capes or those with immense power. Sometimes, it's found in the quiet resolve of an ordinary person who decides to stand up against injustice, even when fear looms large. Danielle's bravery reminds us that one act of courage can change the course of lives, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Charles's journey highlights another profound truth. Trust is fragile, but redemption and gratitude can heal even the deepest wounds. His ability to recognize Danielle's selflessness not only saved his life but restored his faith in humanity. This story teaches us that loyalty, courage, and justice aren't just lofty ideals. They're choices we make every day. Whether it's speaking up against wrongdoing or extending a hand to someone in need, our actions have the power to inspire hope and change. If this story moved you, remember that courage starts with small acts. Share this video to inspire others. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that remind us of the power of humanity. Together, we can keep the conversation alive.